Hello everyone and welcome back to Com 350. This week on the syllabus we are covering Kenneth Burke. I did start that with the in-classroom class yesterday and I will continue and finish it tomorrow, but for now, for continuity's sake, I'm just going to give you the full video, the full lecture all at once. It's going to be long, so I just kind of want to let you know that off the top of the hour here. So Kenneth Burke was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was raised a Catholic, and he was an interesting sort of character. These things will become important later on when we talk about where his perspective and paradigms come from, and also where his methodologies come from. He never went to college. We believe that he finished his formal training in high school. He was offered different scholarly positions at different universities to study there. He chose not to. He was a literary critic who ran a magazine called The Dial, D-I-A-L, and The Dial was a place for critics to write about the modern literature of the time. Kenneth Burke also married a woman and had a few children with her, and then they got separated or divorced. I'm putting that in air quotes for a reason. They got separated or divorced, and he married her sister, and they had kids together. So very, very confusing time for them, I'm sure. But I say air quotes for the divorce and separation because they all lived together, if I understand correctly, in New Jersey. And at some point, he moved them there and they all lived together, which is kind of weird. But he was a little bit weird, not so much though that his intellect was, somehow stunted from that. He was an incredibly smart man. He never wrote directly about rhetoric, although he kind of sort of did. And I'm not sure if he understood the real impact of a debate that he got into with a different critic a long time ago. And I can't think of his name, I apologize. But Burke and this guy argued in, I believe, competing articles like in other journals, academic journals, where Burke was arguing that rhetoric is everything. It's the artistic, it's the persuasive, it's all of that put together. So poetry can make an argument, and argument can be as aesthetically pleasing as poetry. And the other guy obviously disagreed. So he was coming from that perspective that Ramus sort of bore out for us, that rhetoric was not to include reason, it was only to include the speech part of rhetoric. So they had this debate. I would like to think that Burke won, since his is the name I remember. And he's the one I think is the more important. He tried to write a trilogy before he died. It started off with a grammar of motives, and I believe that came first, and then second was the rhetoric of motives. His third one was supposed to be called the symbolic motives, but that never got fully written, so it never got published as a piece, and some of his students have picked up where he left off and tried to build a series of articles that would sort of be the symbolic position. However, Burke gives us a lot on symbolism, symbols, and so on. So we're going to talk about all of that because it's important. Now, as a critic, Burke hung out with some of the greatest artists of the time in Greenwich Village, New York. We're talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald. We're talking about Jack Kerouac, some of the beatnik poets of the 1960s there in Greenwich. So you can read all about them if you want to. If you've seen The Great Gatsby, that was F. Scott Fitzgerald. And if you heard of Jack Kerouac, that's because he wrote some of the newest, at the time, most inventive writing at the time as far as the novel was concerned. So he wrote, one of his novels that he wrote is called A Stranger in a Strange Land, which you might have heard reference to a few times, or better yet, On the Road, which is just this list of experiences that he had while he was traveling. And it's extremely first person, very much about the self. Now that might not sound abnormal to you. However, we're coming into this time period of the late 1800s to the early 1900s with the perspective that a book, a novel, should follow a very specific plan. Remember, this is the modern position, right? You plug and play. So you put it in there, you use a formula, and you see what comes out at the end, and then you can evaluate the novel based on that formula. We're talking about the plot, the development of characters, where the climax occurs in the story, whether or not there's a conclusion that's satisfactory at the end. Those are the kinds of things that Burke was looking at and working with. He later determines that the modernist position might be a little stale and sort of addresses a little bit about the postmodern, which we're going to get into in a couple weeks. So Burke's initial job as a literary critic, he did several things. Probably one of the most famous things that he did was he wrote a piece called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, where he took Mein Kampf and he wrote what some people call a defense of Mein Kampf. I've reread it several times. It is not a defense, but it does kind of point out some faults that we have even currently in modern day, and that is this. Hitler told us exactly what he was going to do. He laid out the plan very clearly. He blamed a group of people, the Jewish people, and he told them that another group was exalted, that would be the Aryan race, for the most part. And so that's how we got where we got, because he said the only thing that we could do is exterminate them all. Now, I'm sure that most people, if they read that work, which they probably didn't, since it was written in German, I only read translations, obviously, and I don't know how accessible that would have been, but Burke read it, and I doubt he read it in the original German, so there had to be translations somewhere, which is important. But also, he literally says, this guy told us what he was going to do, and we all were like, nah, he will never do that, and then he did it, and now we look back on it like this was an atrocity, this was a travesty. Of course it was. But what would have happened if we had figured out that he meant what he said? And so it's sort of a cautionary tale that Burke uses in this critique. He also provides us with one of his three rhetorical lenses, if you will, methodologies that I'm going to talk about today. So we will get back to that. Don't let that go. Obviously, with Burke being born in 1896-ish, 1897, somewhere in there, he also survived the First World War, the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, and he died in 93 or 94, and I know he was alive when the Persian Gulf War began. So his life was defined by war and by Catholic guilt in a lot of ways. And we're going to see those two things play out here over the course of the next several minutes, okay? So keep that in mind as we go into understanding and learning about Burke and the way that he saw rhetoric. All right, let's get started then. And I'm going to start off with Burke's paradigm. Now, again, this is his overarching theme, his overarching ideas, overarching theory. It's his perspective on how he sees the world. That perspective is called dramatism, literally dramatism. Dramatism is the idea that we can read a book, look at a speech, look at a poem, and we can evaluate it as if it is a play going on in front of us, or a movie, which at the time it would have been more plays, not movies, but we can literally determine the most important thing that Burke thinks about the way that humans are in the world and the way that rhetoric works, and that is motives. So you might recall that I told you his trilogy was a grammar of motives, a rhetoric of motives, and then a symbolic of motives. And so you can tell that what he's wondering is why we do and say the things that we do and say. It's not so much about how we do it or setting a goal. It's what's driving us to do it. And he says if we can figure that out, then we would understand each other a lot better. Okay, so his paradigm is dramatism, where you see everything as if it's a drama that could be evaluated as an artistic drama in order to find motive. Okay. Burke also defines human beings, and it's this really, really long paragraph. I'm going to send it to you all on Blackboard. No, I don't expect you to memorize it or learn it so much as just read it and pay attention to it, because it gives you a lot of insight into the human condition. He talks about the fact that humans are not set apart from the rest of the world, from animals, for example, because they communicate. That's not what does it. I mean, my goodness, I was at the lake house this past weekend, and there was some bird that was just repeating its call at 6 o'clock in the morning, just over and over and over and over again. And I couldn't stand it anymore. I ended up going inside the house to get away from it. Well, they're communicating. Right? They're communicating. So what makes humans different? Well, humans are symbol using animals. That's the first thing. Symbol misusing animals, sometimes intentionally, who seek out an answer to the question why. In other words, humans seek out meaning through their communication, not just to communicate information, probably like birds do, for example. I guess we don't really know if the birds have motives, or if our dogs have motives, or you know, if we can determine anything other than I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need to be fed, or I need to be, you know, bathed, I'm hurting, I'm sick, whatever. Those are the kinds of communication we assign to our animals, but we don't really know. We don't actually really know all that much about humans and their motives either, but at least we know that humans ask the question, why am I here? Why is this happening? Why are we doing this? What is the reasoning behind this? This can apply to pretty much anything. I was watching a solar eclipse down in northeastern Arkansas, and you know, that eclipse, when it started, all the birds started going nuts. They were just talking to each other and flying from one tree to the next. And if you think about it, it makes sense, because a bird does not know why that's happening. And they don't know that the sun's going to come out again. And they rely on nature being predictable and constant and happening all the time. We can, you know, sort of reason out why that's happening, and there's a very clear scientific reason for it. But the birds don't really think that way. So they freak out for a few minutes. Maybe your pets freaked out a little bit. I'm sure my geckos, I wasn't here, but I'm sure they were like, came out of their caves like, what's going on? Why is it so dark? Because they like the dark. You know, there's all sorts of impact from the sun eclipse. And yet, the only people who want to look into the why of it, the only animals that want to look into the why of it are humans, okay? That does greatly set us apart from every other member of the animal kingdom, every other mammal, okay? So that's important to keep in mind, because it plays into the motives of why things are being done the way that they're being done. Oftentimes it's because we're attempting to find meaning. Okay, so keep that definition in your sort of back of your head, and I will send you the full definition, which is, it's really long and complicated, but I will send that to you just so you have it for a frame of reference, and that's it. So what can we learn from Burke then, if he wrote all of these, or he had all these different perspectives and definitions and ideas? What can we learn from that? As I said, Burke was a literary critic, which means much like us as rhetorical critics, he had to have a methodology for understanding a novel or a poem or a speech. So he actually has several. I'm only going to talk about 3, because I think that these 3 are the most important, the most easily understood, and the most helpful when we're looking at rhetorical artifacts like you're going to be doing for paper 2. Okay, so What is the first one? Well, Burke, as I told you, he lived during the time of a lot of war. And what does war indicate? It indicates that humans are separating themselves from each other. They constantly try to, separate from each other, and then there's conflict. One of the reasons for this is that when we are born completely separate from everybody else, okay? Even conjoined twins, we're talking mentally separated, socially separated. We experience the world differently. That's not really that much of a shocker, I don't think. However, Burke says in order for us to do anything in the world, we must communicate, right? In order to build a bridge, in order to pave a road, in order to build anything, in order to get something done, we need more than just us as individuals. This has been proven over and over again. Not a real big light bulb moment either. How do we manage to bring ourselves back together if we're constantly separating ourselves? And the answer to that question is that we identify other humans in the world and we get them to identify us. Okay? So that sounds as easy too, but even think about this, just something as simple as saying hi. Okay? If you take the time to say hi, you are acknowledging the other person and you are trying to get them to acknowledge you. All right? So it's sort of a state of persuasion of trying to get them to acknowledge you, to recognize you as another human, to bridge that gap that separates every single human being from each other. If you've ever been to New York, one of the things that you're not supposed to do is make eye contact with anybody on the street, because as soon as you do, they see that as a recognition, they see that as identification, and they'll come and try to sell you a CD, or they'll come and ask if you'll tip them for their music, or they're selling, I don't know, an old playbill, whatever it is that they're doing. And that is very true, because there's a lot of people in New York who do that. Whenever we run into somebody at the store that we really don't want to see, what do? We hide. We go to another store. We get behind a clothing rack. We do whatever we can to avoid even seeing them or allowing them to see us, because we don't want to be identified. If we're walking in downtown, and this could happen with you all very, very easily. If we're walking downtown and one of you sees me and you go, "Oh, hi, Dr. Dudash," and I just keep walking, not likely to happen. I'm more likely to fake it and be like, "Oh yeah, obviously I know you because you know my name," right? That's another identifying marker, is our names. So you know me because you used my name. And so that puts some pressure on me to identify with you as well, to recognize you. And so if, for example, I just walked past you though, you would assign every negative meaning that you possibly could to that. She hates my guts. She doesn't even know her own students. None of you would probably go immediately to the thing that's true, which is that I didn't hear you. Because if somebody says, "Hi, Dr. Dudash," I always respond. There's no other Dr. Dudashes in this, I don't even think in the state, but definitely not in Springfield. So I definitely will respond, but what if I didn't? I don't know if you remember being in school. Maybe you guys didn't do this because maybe you were looking at a phone. Times have changed. But back in my day, you would walk through the hallway, and if the cute boy or girl that you saw acknowledged your presence, you were all giddy because somehow that made things good and better. But if you were walking through the hallway and they just ignore you, they don't even know that you exist, well, that's a big complaint of all teenagers, isn't it? All tweens and teenagers, is they don't even know I exist. So this is not really brand spanking new information, but what it does is it forces us to really consider what the most simple communication tasks bring to our lives. Now, one of the things that we identify with is not just identifying people by name, but identifying with our shared common ground. What do I mean by that? Common ground. That is, what is shared between us that helps me to identify with you and get you to identify with me. For example, I know that you all value getting a diploma. I know that you are in an online class. I know that you're bored to tears with these lectures. I know that you answer questions on a test. Like, these are things we know. I don't know that you live in Springfield or Nixa like I do. I don't know if you feel the same way I do about everything. I don't know if you value education or just a degree. I don't know any of these things about you, right? In fact, I can tell you some of those things about people that I'm in the classroom with, but when you're doing this online, there's no way for me to know why you're here, what you want to do. There's no way to get to know you personally, is the way a lot of people say it. This is why I tell you to email me a picture of a penguin, just so that I can know that you're acknowledging the agreement between us, which is the syllabus, right? It's an acknowledgement, but most importantly, it's an identifier. We're also all human. So we need to eat, we need to drink, we need air to breathe, right? There are basic things on the surface of common ground that we need. Therefore, our common ground can indicate shared values as well. And I'm moving my hand down because we're talking about below ground. We're talking about beneath the common shared ground. Do we share any core values? So, for example, I said to you that I know that you're all here to get a degree. That's important to you. But I don't know that education is important to you. So in this case, the degree, being in this class, getting an A or whatever grade you want, is our shared common ground. Do you want an education is a deeper value that you may or may not share. What those things indicate to us is your motive, right? If you're just in this class to get a grade and get a diploma at Missouri State University, then you are going to behave differently than if you're someone who finds it fascinating and really wants to study and not just memorize or produce, but also to learn and demonstrate that learning. And that's not a bad thing, by the way. I'm not being critical if we don't all value education versus getting a diploma. Getting your degree is important just for survival sometimes out there in the real world. I can't weld, I can't do carpentry, I can't do math, so I can't be an architect. All of these things that are practical skills, I can't do them. I need people to do them. If you know a good bonded union electrician, let me know. I need one. And those are harder and harder to find because we've put so much emphasis on get a degree to get a job so that you can live the lifestyle that you want to live. And that's okay. I mean, that's valid. So if you come into this going, well, yeah, I don't really want to spend my time rhetorically criticizing everything or looking at everything from a certain prescribed perspective, I get that. It's totally understandable. If you don't want to read extra from some of these authors, if you don't want to even read the readings you're getting now, I get it. Okay, been there. I've been right where you are. So, what are these shared values at the core that are below ground, below common ground? Well, they are what we would call more substantial or substantive values. So, getting a degree, common ground value for all of us. Education, that's more substantive and not necessarily applicable to all of us, right? So what Burke does is he takes that and he makes up a word, in a way. It's a word now that a lot of people are using it. Churches are using it. I've heard it in political speeches. And that word starts off with a Latin phrase, con, C-O-N, which means together or with, and substantial, which means below and being firm. So substantial, below the common ground, an important value. He puts this word all into one and calls it consubstantiality. sure that's mentioned in your book, so I'll let you find the spelling there. But consubstantial, what does it mean to have consubstantiality with another? Well, I'll be honest with you, for Burke, what it means is if you achieve consubstantiality, you won't have to do any work to persuade somebody. You will be able to persuade them with no problem. So a lot of times in our speeches and in artifacts, the first thing we have to do is get people to believe that we are consubstantial in some way in order to persuade them to buy an item or to listen to us or to elect us or whatever. Consubstantiality is persuasion. That's another way to word that. It's the key to persuasion. It's the only way you're going to persuade somebody according to Burke. All of that I just talked about is our first methodology, our first rhetorical lens, and it's known as the theory of identification. Next, I'm going to talk to you about a very, at the time, modern idea. And when I say modern, I mean modernist, as in it has a very specific form and formulaic way of evaluating an artifact. It is called the pentad, P-E-N-T-A-D. The pentad, pent meaning five, of course, is a five-part way of evaluating, usually in this case, a literary work, but any artifact. You have five parts, which are the agent, the agency, the act, the scene, and the purpose. Let's take those each in turn. An agent is the person doing the thing. Whatever it is in the plot that someone is doing, a character is doing, that is who we're talking about when we say agent. Agency. Agency is the thing that gives us the power to do what we want to do the act. For example, if you're wondering, why is Dr. Dudash spending so much time talking about this author? Well, Dr. Dudash is the agent. What is her agency? It's simple. She's the professor. So if you want to do well in the class, we grant me agency to do this because it's my job. The act is the thing that we do, and that's me droning on and on and on about Kenneth Burke. The scene, and this is where things get complicated just for us for the moment, and sometimes with mass media, sometimes with any mediated event, it gets questionable because here's the thing. My environment, my scene, as you can see, is very different from your scene. Even as you sit here watching it, you're not seeing the same thing I am, okay? So you have to evaluate what the scene actually is. In your case, the scene is you watching this on a recorded digital screen, and that you are watching me in my office, and then we go from there. The scene is usually pretty important. And then finally, the purpose. Now, I'm not really sure why Burke puts this in there, because again, he is looking for motives. But purpose. What is going to be achieved by Dr. Dudash giving this lecture? Are you going to learn? No, I can't force you to learn. No one can force you to do that. That's a choice you have to make. Is it my purpose for just being able to do my job and get paid? Well, sure. I mean, that's part of it, right? Part of my purpose is to do my job. A third thing might be that I want you to learn about all of this, so there's a desire for me to share my knowledge, right? So there's a number of different purposes that we can assign to any act, including, by the way, me ignoring you on the street downtown, right? There's so many purposes we can assign to an act, and we need to figure out what purpose it is in order for us to understand the motives. Now, that's a really simple way to look at something and just plug and play. Okay, here's the act, the agency, the agent, the scene, and the purpose, and I'm done. But that doesn't tell us anything. So where the critical part comes in is the most important part of the pentad, which is known as ratios. R-A-T-I-O-S, ratios. I'm spelling it out because I don't want you to think it's some funky word that never existed before. However, if you're asking yourself, why the hell would he call it that? I agree. I have no idea. But let me explain to you what a ratio is. A ratio is 2 or 3 parts of the pentad that you pull out as being the most important to understanding the motive behind why an artifact is the way that it is. Normally, we could say, well, in the case of Dr. Dudash doing this lecture, what are her motives? Most likely, the things that are going to indicate my motives is going to be my agency, it's my job, and also my purpose, to give you enough information for you to get a grade, the grade you want, right? So the scene purpose ratio is what you would look at in this example. Sometimes people use 3 of them. Oftentimes scene is the most important, or not most important, scene is the most frequently used as a grounding point of ratios in a criticism. So again, the most important part of a pentad is a ratio, the ratios, and those are the relationship between the 5 elements that Burke says need to be present to view the world from a dramatistic perspective. I let you guys catch up on writing while I take a drink. Hopefully that helps you a little bit. I know sometimes these can go really fast. So the third and final perspective / rhetorical lens / methodology that I'm going to give you that you could potentially use for paper 2. I gave you the theory of identification. I gave you the pentad, and this is called the guilt redemption cycle. Remember, I told you that his Catholic guilt would become important later, and it does right here. And in fact, it becomes important in the rhetoric of Hitler's battle, which is the journal article from which we call or sort of create this methodology. The guilt redemption cycle is based on the dramatistic paradigm, the idea of finding motive. But in this case, Burke tells us all of us are driven by this cycle, this guilt redemption cycle. So I'm trying to decide whether to describe it first or give you an example first. I'm going to give you an example first. So, there used to be a time when getting into an elevator, you were not to make eye contact and not to talk to the people in the elevator. After a while, we started making eye contact with each other in elevators, and then eventually we started talking in elevators, and now we're back to silence and avoiding eye contact, but usually with our headphones in. They're playing so loud that we can hear them. So there's an elevator etiquette, if you will. And that elevator etiquette is the current status quo. It's how we're living in the world. And it's a hierarchy. With requirements and rules. It is what Burke would call the symbolic order. Okay? There's an order to it in the social contract. There's a structure. There are reasons why. Similarly, when you're in a classroom, generally it used to be that your professor was the one that was in the right. And if they gave you a grade, you had to deal with that grade. There wasn't a lot of this going to the professor and begging for 2 points like that. Not that that's happened this semester at all to me, thank goodness, but it does happen. I did it myself to Dr. Bill Gare, who was my modern novel teacher, and he gave me a C on a paper, and I lost my world. And I went in and I was like, I really need to know how to improve. You can't just give me a C and not comment on it. So he and I sat and we went through it, and then he told me because I came in to see him and I worked on it, he would give me a B. Now, you might think, oh my God, Dr. Dudash, you were that student, weren't you? You were the one that if you got a B, flipped out, that you only got A's and you deserved A's. And the answer to that is definitely not. I graduated from college with a 2.77. Proudly. I was lucky I graduated at all, to be honest with you. It was pretty rough. But the reason why I'm telling you that is because in the classroom, it's generally, or in a course, it's generally accepted that if your professor says something, we are acknowledging that they have credibility, we're acknowledging that they have some sort of power over us to grade our papers, right? Well, I had Dr. Bulgara in 1993 to 1994. So keeping that in mind, it was in the late 80s that we started to adopt this, what we call the business model of education. And what that is more than just, I want to know what I did and I want to do better. And, I'm going to go talk my professor into this. It morphed into this idea of I'm paying you your salary, and therefore you should give me an A so I can get my diploma. And I know all of you are thinking, well, I don't think that way, and you probably don't. But that is the general way that a lot of education has been going. We demand you be here, not the other way around, right? That's what you guys say. We demand that our professors be there, that they show up, that they grade things as soon as we want them to be graded, that they give me the grade that I want and deserve, right? And that's not really an entitlement thing at all. What that is the way that education has morphed or evolved over the past 40 years. And I could say that with honesty because when I was in college was about the time it started to make this change. And that's what let me, in my own personal feelings, go to Dr. Bilger and say, I deserve a higher grade. I think my mother was mortified by that, right? But now it's commonplace. It's commonplace for us to say, come see us about your grade. If you have a problem with it, just ask. We'll talk through it. Maybe I made an error. Maybe there's a math mistake. Or maybe you will learn something different about what you need to know based on the criticism, right? There's a lot of things that can happen in there that are very, very good, by the way. So, again, I'm not being critical. I'm saying it was different. So that was the structure. That was the symbolic order. Now, there's a reason I'm telling you both of these, the elevator and the symbolic order. It's probably hard for you to imagine, but when I came here in 2006, a lot of people mistook me for a student. I had really dark brown hair because that was my natural color. I dressed, honestly, like a beatnik poet one of the other professors used to say that to me. She's like, every time I come around and I see you standing there with your cigarette and your scarves, I just thinking, boy, she just would fit into Greenwich Village in the 1960s. And I guess I dressed a little bit that way back then. Once I got married in 2014, I was like, let the hair go gray, wear whatever I want. I mean, it gets to the point where you don't care. That's me. But I looked a lot younger in 2006. Obviously, I looked a lot younger 3 years ago, right? I mean, as you start to push 50, you start getting older faster real quick. So people would mistake me for a student a lot because of the way that I dressed. I carried a backpack, not a satchel. I was very, very much still a student myself in a lot of ways. So I get into the elevator on the 3rd floor of Craig one day, and a group of students, and if I recall correctly, they were all female. I'm not positive, but I know the student who spoke definitely was, because I remember it that clearly. They all come in, and phones are a thing, but not really the big thing. There were definitely no cell phones in the classroom, not because we said there shouldn't be any, but because people just didn't use them. That was part of the symbolic order at the time. So this is probably around 2008-ish. that this happened. And so I'm standing there and I'm pushing the one button for everybody because they're getting in after me. And I hear as the elevator starts, and you know as well as I do that the Craig Hall elevator is slower than Moses and molasses, right? I mean, it is slow. So I'm like, okay. I'm standing there and I hear this girl go, oh my God, I failed my test. You know, I totally failed my test. And I need to call everybody I know and tell them about it. And she goes, you know, honestly, the professor did write kind of a tricky test. There were some questions on there that were really kind of questionable. I'm not really sure that we covered them. But it could also be that I got drunk the other night and I didn't really study. Hee hee hee. And it was funny and it was cute and it was normal. This is how people talk, of course. It's how I would have talked, not in an elevator, when I was, you know, their age at that time. So I'm standing there and I'm realizing that this person probably has no clue that I'm a professor in the department and that I know who she's talking about, and that I, you know, am hearing her say this, right? Of course, I'm not going to embarrass anybody and mortify them by saying, by the way, I'm a professor. But I just let it go and sort of smiled in the back of my head and thought, wow, that's the way we all are. So what happened? Well, clearly she violated the symbolic order. Okay? A number of ways. One, talking in an elevator at that time was a violation of the symbolic order, that sort of agreed upon order. Number two, she is blaming her professor. Well, no. Number two, she failed an exam. Right? Which for her, in her world, is a problem. Now, you might think, well, for all of us, that's a problem. Well, only in the sense that in the symbolic order that we live in, the status quo that we live in, grades are important to pass to get your diploma so that you could go out and get a job, right? In the end, on the most basic levels, that's the case. I'm kicking everything around my office right now. Sorry about that. So she also, third, violated the symbolic order that your professor is right. Usually, you give deference to the professor, okay? So what does she do once she violated the symbolic order by getting this F, by talking in the elevator? Well, she doesn't really do anything about talking in the elevator because it became more commonplace, you know, a lot more commonplace between 2005 and 2010. So, you know, she wasn't really violating a symbolic order per se for her right then and there. That was my own symbolic order. And so, but in the elevator, you know, talking about your professor that way, but, you know, really what it is you made a mistake. You messed up. You violated the symbolic order. She did in this case. So what do we all do when we violate the symbolic order? Well, the first thing we usually do is we feel guilty. We feel bad about ourselves. We think, boy, I should have studied harder. Or how am I going to tell anybody I failed this exam? Or what if this keeps me from graduating? Or what if this keeps me from getting a passing grade in this class so that I could graduate? Whatever. All of those things are in our symbolic order, and we feel guilty when we violate it. Interestingly enough, I do know people who don't care if they violate the symbolic order. And most of those people have some, I'm not talking about it talking in an elevator, but majorly, for example, I don't know, hurting someone, killing someone, using hate speech against people, all of those things are violations of the symbolic order. In this case, we're talking about something pretty simple, but when we feel guilty about something, what do? According to Burke, we tell everybody. We confess. We go out there and we talk about it. I've got to call everybody I know right now and tell them that this happened. So right now she's right on schedule for the symbolic, or for the guilt redemption cycle. She has violated the symbolic order. And she is now confessing it. And in confessing it, she does step 2 of the cycle. So first we have a violation of the symbolic order, and second, we have a way of explaining or confessing what went wrong. And according to Burke, in the Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, we have 2 choices. Anybody has 2 choices. One, you can go through a process called mortification. Mortification is when you say that it's your fault. I did this thing. And therefore, I feel this way about it. I feel bad about it. I shouldn't have done that. And you see this in this example by the young lady who said, well, I was drinking a couple nights ago and didn't really study, right? That's her way of accepting responsibility for that. That's her mortification process. The other process is to be a victim of circumstance or of other people, that violating the social order was not your doing. Somebody else did it. So it's called scapegoating. So we have mortification, and then we have scapegoating. And scapegoating is the exact opposite of mortification. We don't take any responsibility for what happened or our role in it. What we do is we say, this is somebody else's fault. So either mortification or scapegoating. In the case of Hitler, in case you're wondering about Mein Kampf, in the case of Mein Kampf, Hitler scapegoats. He talks about all these problems in German society, the banks, the rulelessness, the lawlessness, or whatever it was that he saw, and he goes out there and says, this is their fault. And their fault is the entire Jewish population. Okay? And that's how he justified his actions, by saying, I'm a victim of them. You are a victim of them. In order to go through the final step, the third step of redemption, you have to either, if you were practicing mortification, is to find a way to transcend that. Okay, like for example, saying, this is my fault, I did it. However, now I know, I've learned my lesson on blah, blah, blah. Or in the end, there was some benefit to it. Okay? Whereas with scapegoating, you don't do any transcendence. It's victimage. I am the victim of someone else. So when you use mortification, you transcend it to get redemption. When you use scapegoating, you make yourself a victim in order to find redemption and rejoin the symbolic order. I'm going to give you one more example. My son, who is 22 and in the Navy now, so this story has a fine ending, but when he was 17 years old, he decided that he did not need mom and dad, or as he liked to call us, Elizabeth and Jason, that he raised himself, that's funny. It's adorable when we say that. That he could live on his own and live better on his own, and he wouldn't have to do work or chores or anything to earn the right to drive the car, and for us to pay for his insurance, and for us to pay for his phone and all these other things. That he could do all of that on his own. He didn't need us. What are you going to do? You got a 17-year-old young man who is 200 pounds and could take out either one of his parents, believe it or not, mainly because I'm weak and my husband is smaller than my son. And so we were like, okay. And he ran away at the age of 17. And I put that in air quotes because He ran away, and some cousins of ours who decided to be jerks intervened and took him in, and he lived with them for 4 months, and then apparently they got sick of him and kicked him out, and he went on to live on his own, couch surfing, sleeping in his car, those kinds of things, and moving up to Bolivar, and we didn't know where he was. We did know that he was alive based on what some people had told us, like, oh, Cody checked in. But that was about all we knew. I still kept my health insurance on him. He still had car insurance. You know, there were all these things that we did because as parents you feel you need to, but at the same time, as my mother is fond of reminding me, I let my son go and was like, you go to you, man. I can't deal with this anymore. I mean, he just became impossible, right? About 18 months later, he comes back. Not with his tail between his legs or anything. He had just gotten an apartment and some other things. He was getting back onto his feet. But as we were talking, I said, you know, you could do this a lot easier by moving back into our basement. Now, our basement, I need to tell you, because I know people like picture like some like cement block basement. It's finished. There's 2 bedrooms. There's a full bath. There's a den with a fireplace and a living and a TV and couches. There's a little table there with a refrigerator. I mean, it's pretty much a full apartment. And there's outdoor access out the back door. So when I say I told him he could live in the basement, it's not like I was telling him to be like a troll, right? So about 2 weeks after he moves back in with us, he comes up the stairs and he looks at me and he goes, are you telling me this could have all been mine this whole time? And I said, yeah, dumbass, when you left, we were moving you down into the basement. Don't you remember? We had all your clothes and garbage bags. We were taking all of your stuff downstairs for you to move in there. Oh, yeah, I'm an idiot. And then he proceeded to tell me that we could not have done anything to convince him of this, that he needed to be with us, that he needed his parents, that he needed his family, that he needed help. He never would have been able to do that if he hadn't run away for those 18 months. And so while I suffered greatly, he learned his lesson. And so he did both when he came back. You know, how did he violate this symbolic order? He started calling us Jason and Beth and didn't acknowledge us as parents and told us we were not helping him at all, that he raised himself, all that stuff, violation of the symbolic order every which way but loose. When he came back, he said, you know, I didn't know that this could all be mine, but I learned my lesson. So a little bit of a scapegoat, but a little bit of transcendence. But then he also says, well, no, I guess that's scapegoating really more than anything else. A little bit, yeah, a little bit of scapegoating, I guess, saying I didn't know, or, you know, I felt this way because you guys did something, whatever it was. And then a little bit of transcendence, I learned my lesson. And then there's victimage, right? That I am doing this completely wrong, aren't I? Wow, I lost my train of thought, kids. Hold on one second. Okay. He uses mortification. Back up. When my son decided to rejoin the symbolic order, he practices both mortification and scapegoating. The way that he practiced mortification was by saying, yeah, I'm stupid. I did this. And the way that he achieved transcendence is by saying, but I needed to. That was the only way I was going to learn my lesson. And now I have. And that's good. We'll return back to the symbolic order if that's okay. And then the way that he scapegoated was that he said, well, I didn't know that this could be mine, and you didn't tell me, or something along those lines. And he was sort of laughing when he said it, because of course he didn't mean it, but playing the victim card there. and blaming us a little bit. But he didn't do that very much. I think he was just trying to get underneath my skin a little bit, which it didn't. It didn't bother me very much. But his redemption came through more through his transcendence and mortification than it did through his scapegoating and victimage. And normally, mortification and transcendence is your better choice for redemption. So, let's look at this cycle again, and I'm going to be very, very clear with it this time. First, we start with the symbolic order, the status quo, the hierarchy, who's in what position, who has what power, who has what agency, etc. Then somebody violates that order. Okay, so they violate the symbolic order by doing something that goes against the symbolic order. So they seek redemption by doing one of two things, or both: scapegoating and making themselves a victim for empathy, for sympathy, so that they can rejoin the symbolic order, like, oh gosh, shucks, I'm sorry I did that kind of thing. But I did it because you guys made me do it. I mean, that's scapegoating, right? It's your fault, and I'm a victim, so you should let me rejoin the symbolic order now. That doesn't work nearly as well as I totally screwed up, and I learned from this, and it won't happen again. Can I please come back into the symbolic order? Which is normally what we do. And then we rejoin the symbolic order. And I guarantee you within 5 minutes, we're going to violate it again in some tiny way. With the rhetoric of Hitler's battle in Mein Kampf, Burke is very clear that this is not a tiny thing, which is obvious. When you read the work, if you read the work, you might think to yourself, boy, he's just laying it all out there, isn't he? We do, however, have the value of hindsight. So it's important for us to remember that when people were reading this book, when they read what he said, they were like, okay, this is just some dude who's having issues, and I hope he feels better now, right? They didn't think this is going to lead to mass genocide, right? So, I mean, I don't blame anybody for that, but Burke called it out. He said, hey, look, and of course Burke, he was writing this well after the Second World War, so, he had the value of hindsight as well. So, what did we talk about today? Well, a lot of things, but we need to focus on dramatism is Kenneth Burke's paradigm. Within that paradigm of viewing the world as a drama, he provides us with more than three, but we're looking at three methodologies to examine an artifact, a rhetorical artifact, or three lenses, rhetorical lenses, to see that artifact through. No matter what, he gives us three ways for analysis. One, the theory of identification. How does the artifact get people to identify with it, and it identify what the audience needs in order for it to be persuasive? Second, the pentad, a very functional approach to rhetoric through the dramatistic eye, right? And it's sort of plug and play with the 5 parts of the pentad, but the most important part are the ratios or the relationships between 2 or 3 of those concepts within the pentad. And then finally, the guilt redemption cycle, which of course is based on the idea that we all suffer from guilt because we live in a symbolic order that is hierarchical, has rules, and sometimes we violate those rules, and we have to confess those rules and find a way to get out of it. We have to look for redemption through one of 2 ways: scapegoating or mortification. And then we could be redeemed and rejoin the symbolic order. Okay? Probably the best example of this I saw in a paper once was somebody used, you probably don't know who the Chicks are. At the time they were known as the Dixie Chicks. They're a country band from Texas. They had gone to a concert in England, and right after President George W. Bush said we're going to attack Afghanistan after the attacks on 9/11. And they said, we're not proud that our United States president came from our home state. I believe that was literally all they said. Now, personally, I don't see that as a violation of the symbolic order, but Toby Keith did. And Toby Keith proceeded to convince every radio station and video station to get rid of their music, to stop playing it, got stores to stop selling it, got people to burn it in public, and saying that she's anti-American and, this is not the way a patriot acts, and so on and so forth. Well, later on, the Chicks come back and they proceed to write an album, a whole album that is nothing but Natalie Maines, the lead singer, who was the one who said what she said, going through different processes of mortification and scapegoating. But there's one song that was super popular off of that album, and it was called I'm Not Ready to Make Nice. Not Ready to Make Nice is literally her saying, I'm not going to forgive anybody yet. I'm not okay with this yet. Our lives were essentially destroyed, and I'm not going to make up for it now. I'm not apologizing for what I said, and I'm not ready to make it all okay again. All right? That was a really good analysis. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I don't remember if it was well written or not, but I remember I enjoyed reading the analysis. So hopefully today, not only did I introduce you to Burke and give you his 3 methodologies, but hopefully you also got some examples of ways that you could do your paper by using Burke's theories if you chose to. Right now, what methodologies do you have to work with? Well, you have the Neo-Aristotelian perspective, which is the 5 canons, including in invention, the inartificial and artificial proofs. Basically, it's taking Cicero and Aristotle and saying, okay, I'm going to apply these concepts to this artifact. Very good for traditional speeches and things like that. Another one that we have now looked at is Burke. And he gives us 3 ways that we can examine an artifact. You're going to get another one next week when we talk about Stephen Toulmin. You're going to get the Toulmin model of argumentation. And then we'll have a critical perspective as well. And you can choose from any one of these to look at an artifact, depending on what strikes you about that artifact and how you want to go about answering it. And again, I want this to be a good experience for you. I want you to enjoy writing this. So pick something that interests you. Pick an artifact that maybe intrigues you in some way, that you have a question about, and then apply an appropriate methodology for the question you're asking about it. I hope this helps. Let me know if you need anything. I do apologize for the length of this video, but we got everything out of the way, and hopefully you could pause it if you need to. And so I will end with that, and I will see you all next week. Call or text or email if you need anything.